Okay, welcome everybody. Today we have a different video lined up for you. We have a debate. Um, I, Diddy, will be the moderator of this debate, and I'm joined by Silvie and Mike or Mr. Evil. Um,
If I can take a moment to interject here, I
okay,
prefer to go by Dr. Evil.
okay,
I did not attend 8 years of evil medical school to be called Mr., but thank you.
okay. So Dr. Evil, comma MD, over here. So for those of you that don't know, I am a guest on Sylvie's channel, where we just talk about current goings on in the world. But Sylvie, being the more cerebral one, was the one who stepped up to volunteer for our debate. And then we're joined by Dr. Evil over here. And the topic of our debate today is Jesus is a myth. So Sylvie or Dr. Evil is taking the affirmative position. So he will be debating. His position is that Jesus is indeed a myth. And then Sylvie is taking the negative position that Jesus is a historical person. So I will get into the specifics of our debate in a second, but I wanted to give a moment for Sylvie and Dr. Evil to introduce themselves. So Sylvie, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so we do the Silvie and Diddy React videos, and that's basically us looking at a lot of pop culture or just whatever comes across. We look at it from a Christian, usually conservative perspective, and we came across Dr. Evil here in one of the comments, and it led to an interesting collaboration. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Evil, to introduce yourself.
By the way, my mother does not call me Dr. Evil. She does call me Mr. Evil. So, basically, I was just a normal guy. This haranguing Christians on the internet, it's not really been my thing. I started finding myself frequenting Christian themed YouTube channels. Well, it's already been a while. It was in 2017. There was a celestial arrangement that made mainstream news, and it's now known as the Revelation 12 sign. And when I read about it, I thought, wow, it has to be that. It can't not be. There were too many very specific aspects to it. So I started going to these Christian themed YouTube channels, and I it was agony. It really was. And anyway, I've since learned that unbelievable arrangement happens every 1,000 years or so. And what I suspect happened is that whoever wrote that verse in Revelation was just looking up at the sky and writing a story. But I couldn't leave behind all these channels I was watching and the nonsense. And you know what? I have recollections from when I was 10 years old. Mommy, why is that? I was raised Catholic, and I remember my dad telling me, I'd pin him down, and he would end up just having to say, it's a mystery. Or I remember talking to my mom saying, what is it with these stupid Christians? I remember my mom telling me, what does it bother you that if they rely on religion to provide solace and peace and comfort to them, and if it helps them be a better person? And I thought, so I thought both of those were good answers until now. So about 3 months ago, I got a notification from YouTube, and it said, congratulations, you have 30 subscribers. 30 subscribers? I don't have any content. Everything's private. And I thought, these are people who've seen my comments and want action. They want video. So I'm kind of learning along the way, and it's been enjoyable. And I've got enough of an audience now where my last sermon last week, I was actually nervous beforehand. I go, people are watching. Anyway, that's my background. Just a normal evil. Is he a scientist, Dr. Evil? You wouldn't call him a scientist. He's just an evil guy. He just wants to take over the world.
My assumption would have been that he's somewhat of a scientist, but yeah, that's a good point. Maybe he doesn't know anything.
He wears a lab coat, but it's not a traditional lab coat, is it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you for those introductions. So with that, I will now introduce the format. So for those of you watching, we will be using the Coolidge debate format, which is the main reason we chose it is to keep this abbreviated, because we all, we don't have all day to sit here and wax on the specifics ad nauseum. So we're going to keep it to about 45 minutes. So if you look up the standard Coolidge debate format, it's I think it comes in around 30 minutes or just over. We've extended a couple sections to provide ourselves a little more time, and the total time comes to about 46 minutes with no stoppage time in between. So it'll if you're watching, it'll be a bit longer than that. But basically, the way we'll start is each position will start with their affirmative speech. And just to give you guys a little background on what the affirmative speech is, you state your case. So this will be Dr. Evil will state his case in favor of Jesus is a myth, and he'll basically describe his points that support that. And then just following that, Silvie will have the opportunity to cross-examine. So he'll ask a series of questions to Dr. Evil, who then will answer those, and that will be Silvie's opportunity to clarify what Dr. Evil's position is. And then we'll do the opposite of that. Silvie will give his negative speech, so he'll state why he believes Jesus is a historical person, and then Dr. Evil will have an opportunity to cross-examine. So, with all that said, Dr. Evil, we are ready to go whenever you are. You have 10 minutes for your affirmative speech, and I'll start the timer whenever you start talking. But if you want to take a moment to ready yourself.
No, I'm ready. Thank you, both Silvie and Diddy. It can essentially be summed up in one sentence that there is literally no contemporaneous evidence that the Bible figure known as Jesus ever existed. None of the gospel authors witnessed him. In the entire first century, Jesus is not mentioned by any historian, any religious scholar, any politician, any philosopher or any poet. His name never occurs in a single inscription, a carving, a sculpture, a monument, and he's not found in any piece of any private correspondence or any official record. Jesus himself never left any archaeological evidence of any kind. There's no artifacts, no tomb, no dwellings, no works of carpentry or self-written manuscripts. When I assert this to Christians, they'll tell me that I'll usually get a response like, well, there's more historical evidence for Jesus than there is for, usually they choose Alexander the Great. I don't know if that makes the rounds in the Christian circles. I don't address individual persons, because if I say, well, look at all the evidence for Alexander the Great, then they'll go down the list, right? Although the only person that I will respond to, if they say, well, there's more evidence for Jesus than there is for Napoleon, which is completely false, by the way, because I've been to the Louvre and I've seen all of his artifacts. but I'll say, we do have Napoleon's penis in a jar. Now, why don't we have Jesus's penis in a jar? By the way, I never thought this was going to go this direction, but why don't we? So the Christian response would be, oh, he resurrected. So poof. And I'll say, well, how come we don't have any artifacts from him? He was recognized as God for 30 years, right? Walked around town in these small towns in Galilee, and right, the star led him to his birth. That's the story. Now, of course, we might get in some gray area about the Jesus is myth versus the myth of Jesus. But he's this guy apparently walking around town. Look, at the very least, he was known throughout Syria, right? He attracted great multitudes, is the term that was used. And there's no record of him. So the Christian response to that would be, well, of course, the Romans trampled the area and destroyed everything associated with Jesus. So it's a perfect brew where you can everything's gone. There's an explanation for everything, right? They've had 2,000 years to consider these things. I would expect. Well, so the other response you get, well, he was just a poor preacher in a small town. Well, yes, but if I'm usually making these assertions on Christian-themed channels, and then my response to that. See, I'm conducting my own debate with myself here. My response to that is, well, you worship him as God, right? Wouldn't you expect to have some evidence that he even existed? People ask me to explain how this all happened. Look around. There's what is it? The world's most the religion has the most adherents, over 1 billion, something like that, Christians out there. How did all this happen? And actually, New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman he's done the math on this, and it doesn't really have to be an incredible growth. If you start earlier enough and increase your growth, relatively modestly, you get to, 2,000 years, you get to 1 billion people. But the way I explain it is we had this prophecy of a Messiah, right? Daniel 9:25, that was for 490 years. Well, the Christians now assert that there's a pause, but that's going to be the topic of this week's sermon. So we had this prophecy, this Daniel 9:25 prophecy, and it begins at this decree by Zassa, whatever it was. Anyway, it basically was going to end what would we now know is about year 0. And at that time, there was a Messiah craze. If you're a Galilean fisherman or a carpenter, being promoted to God, that would be a good career move for you, right? So all these guys are trying to lay claim that they were the prophesized Messiah. And so my assertion is that Messiah never came. And the first mention of that prophesied Messiah that we now know as Jesus is by Paul in 48 AD. That's the first documentation of him. Now, of course, Paul, who was Paul, these Pauline epistles, who was he writing to? Well, he was writing to these prayer houses. So these were residences of generally wealthy people who would accommodate Christians for their worship. So technically, this creation by Paul, as I'm asserting, of Christianity would be, a few years before 48 AD. But that's my assertion. And why would he do it? Well, he wanted to gain support. So at this point, we had a prophesied Messiah, and there's no evidence of it. I'm sure Silvie will have something to say about that. But he basically wanted to get support for this insurrection against the Romans, which began in 46 AD. And it was led by these two brothers, Jacob and Simon in Judea. So he was trying to entice the Gentiles to aid in the Jews' rebellion against the Romans. He's just trying to get more troops. And that was basically it. He was trying to show the Gentiles that the Messiah had come, but he was murdered by the Romans, right? To get the Gentiles to join in their insurrection. So I'll end it there. That's basically my premise.
Thank you, Mike. You do have 2.5 minutes left. You're welcome to use those, or if you officially want to cede that time, we can move on to Silvie's cross-examination.
Jesus would want me to give it to Silvie.
Well, to be clear, Silvie doesn't get the time. We're just gonna it's just gonna drop. So
well, Jesus wouldn't want me to continue further, I'm sure too.
Okay. Silvie, so this is where if Dr. Evil and Silvie, if at any point either of you feels like you want an extra minute or two just to collect your thoughts, we can definitely do that. And then just essentially just let me know when you're ready to get going. So Silvie, whenever you're ready, I will.
Yeah, I'm ready to ask the questions, and then I'll. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Hold on. Let me get the timer set up. So let me just double check my notes. We are going to have 4 minutes for this section. And so just like Dr. Evil, Silvie, you're welcome to use all or as little of that as you'd like. I'll start when you start asking your first question.
Okay. Let's begin. Hi, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thanks, Silvie.
Perfect. Let's start out. You argue that Paul is a historical figure. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that's based on that his writings are contemporaneous. He wrote them himself.
Yes. So we have the Pauline epistles comprise about half of the New Testament books. I think it's one less, it's 49% or something. And half of those Pauline epistles are considered authentic. And the other half, there's largely a consensus on the other half. And they can determine that, and especially in modern times, using sophisticated textual analysis. And ironically, some of the Pauline epistles are more Paul than Paul, right? So in other words, if Paul uses certain phrases or terms, or if he's created
or
a
if he's
certain
using a lot of new words, they'll say we don't know that this is Paul. So just to get it from the horse's mouth, how many of the epistles would you say you would agree to are the historical Pauls? Like,
oh wow,
for the sake of this debate.
Yeah, so this is beyond my area of expertise. I use the infamous internet resource known as Wikipedia, and I can find it for you. Well, anybody who's watching this can find it. But as I always say, Wikipedia is the repository, and the references are there, and so it's a nice source, at least for that. But yeah, so how do I know? So I was just recently in a debate with somebody on one of these YouTube channels. How do you know Paul's real? Well, whoever created these letters, it was one person, right? There's a certain one of them where we can say this is one person. That person's who we now know is Paul, and that person essentially, what I'm asserting, created Christianity.
Well, let's just get into the details then. Would you accept something like Romans, Galatians, Philippians, the letters to the Corinthians to be authentically Paul, or would you dispute that?
Yeah, so as you speak here, I'm going to go to Wikipedia. I just put in a new hold on, wiki Pauline epistles. So I'm sorry to hold up the debate here, but let
That's
me.
okay.
So
While you're
this is
looking
what.
for that, let me just ask you for your perspective. When Paul's referencing the churches that he started, the activities that he's taken place, and the people that he's met, do you view those as historical, like apart from Jesus?
Correct.
So, like in, for example, Galatians, he's mentioning that he goes to Jerusalem, he meets with the people that considered themselves the apostles. He meets with Peter and this guy named James, who's called the brother of Jesus. Like, are those historical figures, or is he making those up? That's kind of the question I
Right.
wanted to ask.
So this is where it gets messy. So if
Mhm.
I'm writing a fiction today, I would use real persons, places, and events to bolster, to create the scenario, right? If I'm
Mhm.
writing about Dr. Evil taking over London, and then I would use real politicians there that I'm discussing. So are these people real? Peter is only exist in church legend. James is called at points the brother of Jesus, but in other places he has, when you add them all together, he has 4 brothers and multiple sisters. So you can see how this gets. I know we're not arguing this today or debating this today, but you can see how the Gospels become embellished and more supernatural as they're retold. But to focus here on Paul, the fact that he is creating characters for a work of fiction to prove that God is true, was true to his word, I do not find unremarkable.
So sorry, we're out of
So
time, but are
with
you saying you do think that it is like that those two were made up?
Yes, correct.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Diddy.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, as Mike was giving his explanation there at the end, we ran out of time.
Yep. Yeah.
So I was gonna say, I know there was some stoppage because of Mike trying to look something up. I don't know if we want to dovetail back to that, just to provide some extra closure, since Mike needed to find a reference. Do we,
Oh, yes.
or
Yeah, but
I
Dr.
can
I'll
read
Evil?
stop
it
I'm
quick.
sorry.
asking my questions. Yeah.
I can read it real quickly. I'm sorry. I
Mhm.
just installed a new what do you call it? Spell checker, and every time I type in, it screws up. Didn't know what wiki was. So the 7 that are considered genuine by most scholars: Galatians, First Thessalonians, First Corinthians, and Second Romans, Philippians, and Philemon. And then the rest are considered. So it's that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. So 6 out of the 13 are considered not genuine.
Okay.
However,
Okay.
that's not really, I'm not sure how germane that is to the debate. The question is, I guess, whether Paul existed. And so there was some person who wrote these that we can establish, wrote at least some of these that created the Christian movement.
Okay, so then with that, we'll go ahead and call that the closure of the of Sylvie's cross-examination of Dr. Evil's negative position. So now we're going to flip the roles. So Sylvie will give his 10-minute speech on why he believes Jesus is a historical person. So again, this is the negative position. The topic of the debate is Jesus is a myth. So Sylvie's taken the negative, Jesus is a historical person, or Jesus is not a myth, might be the more correct way to say that. And then after that, Dr. Evil will have the opportunity to cross-examine. And because of the extra time that we use there during Sylvie's cross-examination, if there needs to be a little extra time for explanation or finding something, we can certainly provide some extra time. So Sylvie, whenever you're ready, I'm going to mute myself and let me reset my timer here. Hold on just a moment. Okay, I'll mute myself, and as soon as you start talking, I will begin the timer.
Let's begin. Today we're asking ourselves a question. Can you have smoke without fire? Can the ripples in the pond exist without something or someone disturbing the water? Can you have Christianity without Christ? My opponent Mike has taken the minimal mythicist position that Jesus is a myth made up by Paul. I take a minimal historical position, which is that an actual man at some point named Jesus acquired followers in his life. The same Jesus is reasonably believed to have been executed by the Jewish or Roman authorities, and the followers of this Jesus held him to be divine in some way. I'm a Christian, but in this debate, I do not maintain that to prove that Jesus is historical, not a myth, you have to therefore accept all claims made by Jesus or his followers. My goal is to provide more confidence in minimal historicism than my opponent provides for mythicism. Before I present my three main arguments to support my position, I want to make two notes. First, the percentage of certainty does not need to be 100% to provide reasonable proof that an historical Jesus existed. This is in part because nothing in our existence is 100% certain. We accept as concrete and true historical events, scientific observations, and relationships with less than 100% certainty. I believe in a round earth, but I do not have 100% certainty that all the evidence is 100% true, nor have I investigated every bit of information. I take on faith experts with their experiments and eyewitnesses' accounts while being in orbit. I believe that the satellite images that I see are not clever forgeries. Second, proof for this debate must be measured by the limits of the ancient world. Although I would love to see video evidence of Jesus' existence or several dozen contemporary autobiographies from his time, to demand that before accepting Jesus' historicity is ludicrous. Rather, I will use the standards in the fields of classic studies, manuscript preservation, archaeological correspondence, and ancient accounts. Alexander the Great, who Mike mentioned, has no surviving contemporary sources, and the earliest writers about his life are 300 to 400 years after the fact. Additionally, there are no 100% verified archaeological artifacts directly linked to him. But we use the best data and research to establish an historical Alexander the Great. I have three key arguments to support the minimal historical position. First, independent corroboration. Second, impressive transmission. And third, irreverent/irrelevant details. First, independent corroboration. There is reason to believe in an event or person if you can derive manuscript evidence from other figures around the time. For Jesus, we have 27 unique writings from the first generation of Jesus' followers attesting to Jesus' life, death, and the fact that he was seen as divine. External to his followers, we have at least 6 non-Christian sources who reference Jesus as an historical person during this era. Josephus at 93 AD, Tacitus at 109 AD, Pliny the Younger from 111 to 113 AD, and Mara bar Serapion, the late 1st century Suetonius at 121 AD, and Lucian in late 150s AD. This is a very rich source of reference for the ancient world. Finally, we appear to have an ossuary or ancient Jewish funeral blocks belonging to James, the brother of Jesus, as well as ancient prayer houses, most notably one of the first ever prayer houses at Megiddo in the Middle East, which has a mosaic with reference to Jesus. Second, we have impressive transmission. We see an impressive transmission of this data in reference to an historical Jesus. The number of transcripts, how early the transcripts are, and the wide range of that transmission geographically and linguistically gives us confidence that it is not some well-kept invention of a lone Paul. Dr. Dan Wallace, a peer scholar of Bar Ehrman, states that we have over 5,500 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, as well as 15 to 20,000 manuscripts in other languages. If these manuscripts were to be stacked on each other, the stack would be taller than 4 Empire State Buildings. This is compared to only 3 to 4 feet tall for the number of manuscripts from the average historical Greek writer. Maybe 10, but in most cases only 1 or 2 manuscripts can be found belonging to various writers, as well as over 1 million quotations from the Church Fathers starting in the 1st century onward reference the historical Jesus. Third, irreverent/irrelevant details. We have details in the writings which would not help unless they were authenticating a real event. Jesus dying by crucifixion, if he is a fictional character, serves no purpose. This is a turnoff to the Jews, to the Greeks, and to the Romans. Women at the tomb were not seen as credible due to legal systems of that day. early apostles disappointing Jesus and failing him, Paul's persecution of the Christians before converting, James, the brother of Jesus' unbelief, the number of fish caught in a given story, Jesus laying his head on a pillow during a storm, Paul listing names of people we don't know, Paul telling Timothy to drink wine with his water. All of these details make a good case for historical happenings rather than fanciful imaginings. These are strong reasons to believe in a historical Jesus. I would now like to spend the rest of this time addressing some of the points that Mike has made. So first off, he mentions that we do not have contemporaneous evidence. And I will agree that the written sources for Jesus come much later than we would like. But that's because we're dealing with the ancient world. We have to define and analyze the evidence based on the days that we're looking at. Prior to the 15th century, where you have a printing press, it's very rare to have contemporaneous sources. It's even rarer to have a multiplicity of sources. With that reasoning, there are very few people, including Alexander the Great, whom we could verify as historical rather than mythical, according to this argument. He mentions that basically, since there's no archaeological evidence, there's no reference earlier on, why wouldn't God do more for this? And the obvious answer is that even in the writings themselves, the manuscriptal arguments from Paul and from the Gospels is that Jesus considers himself a humble person rather than just this divine Hellenistic type of God who comes down and is rich and powerful and has all of this information. To put this into context, even, if you look at the contemporary emperor of Rome during Jesus's day, Emperor Tiberius, he has no greater number of sources that back him up. And the only archaeological evidence we have is a statue at Pompeii, which is probably his. That's for the emperor of the whole known world. Why would we expect from a historical point of view, so we're not using fanciful, this is really God, why doesn't he, carve his name into more rocks in the Middle East? Just from a historical perspective, it's unrealistic to assume that a man from Palestine, from this small, out of the place way, would have more evidence or equal evidence to the emperor of Rome. Let's get into the two basic arguments that Mike makes. The first is the Daniel prophecy and that there's a Messiah craze. Yes, there was a Messiah craze, but often these people did not claim to be divine. They claimed to, in one case after Jesus, be a Davidic descendant, and therefore he had the right to be a Messiah and regain the throne of David. Or else they claimed that they were fighting for Israel and they would deliver them from the Romans. We do not see that in the account of Jesus. Also, there's no reference to the Daniel prophecy. If this was the sole motivation for Paul to make up Jesus, why is there no reference to this prophecy? There are references to many other prophecies, but not to this one. So, Mike, if you can provide that, that would convince me that that is the strong motivation, but it's very absent from it when he references many other promises and prophecies. The second point is that Paul wrote up a Messiah and wanted to gain support and support the Jewish rebelliousness. However, that doesn't fit with even what he himself says. First off, he says that he persecuted the Christians and later joined them. Why would he do that if he's making it up? Was there really a Christian church that he's persecuting? And if he's writing people telling them, I persecuted these people, would they have known that? And the second point is he belonged to the Pharisees, as he self-identifies, who did not rebel against the Roman authorities. And they eschewed what are called the zealots, who did actively fight the Roman authorities. So once again, there seems to be no evidence that Paul, if he really were supporting this, would have fought to make this Messiah figure, who he's also in mentioning didn't fight the Romans, and he himself tells people submit to the governing authorities, which includes the governors and the emperor. But he doesn't claim or identify to be with the zealots, even in his own writing. So I would dispute that that is a good instance or a convincing instance of why he's making up this particular Jesus and why he's writing and making these claims. So all of that to say, I would side with Bart Ehrman, who actually does believe in a historical Jesus and does not believe that he's a fiction, and believes that there are a lot of historical evidence for the existence of Jesus. Thank you.
And that ended just about on the dot.
There we go.
So, Dr. Evil, if you would like a moment or two to gather your thoughts or notes for a cross-examination, you'll have 4 minutes. Wait, let me double check that
Yeah.
again.
Oh, is it a cross-examination or is it, do I get a,
This is the cross-examination. So Silvie
Okay.
did bring up responses to your argument during his negative speech, but during this time of cross-examination, you are asking Silvie questions to solidify your understanding of his position. You have 4 minutes.
and then will I get a chance to rebut what he said?
Yes. So then
Okay.
there will be second and third speeches following the cross-examination. So following your cross-examination, just so you are aware, we will then do the second speech, which first will be second affirmative. So Dr. Evil, that would be you. And there you can respond. And then you can, again, spend those 5 minutes building up your position. Then we'll have the second negative, and then we'll have a final rebuttal after that.
This is going a
for
little
both
bit
sides.
fast for me. So I took notes in anticipation. Yeah. One thing I learned from listening from Silvie is I should have gone to college. So, so, yeah, I took notes in anticipation and I would be rebutting. So what I'll do is I'll try to read my notes and then reconfigure them into a question to be suitable for a cross. Okay, thank you, Silvie. Yeah, you're very well spoken. It was nice. You almost had me in tears there at the beginning. Uh-oh, did we lose our...
We're still there. I don't know.
Oh, we might have lost.
Uh-oh.
He's
The
frozen.
recording
right
is
now.
still going. We will wait.
Dr. Evil. I guess if needed, Silvie, you're still here, right?
I'm still here. You can argue his position.
Are you guys
No.
there?
Okay, you're back. All right.
No, my computer blue screen.
Okay.
Oh no.
The recording is still happening. How is that? That's interesting.
I'm in my bedroom.
Okay.
Okay. So we're getting a
Do
little
you want
more
to
intimate.
continue?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, hold on.
you-
Let me get my notes. Jeez.
Let
That's
us know
funny.
if you need time. You can have some time to set up if you need, because like we're not that rushed.
I cannot believe it. My computer froze. All of a sudden, it blue screened. I haven't had that happen since Windows 95. You give me a moment, and I think I can do. Isn't this funny? On one sense, this is kind of a miracle that we can even do this. On the other hand, okay, I can remember some of it. This is funny. Now my dog is going to come in with me. By the way, I'm in Alaska here, and it's still kind of dark here in the morning. Okay, again, Silvie, thank you. This is, we were wondering about possible technical issues. Okay, so you mentioned, for example, that there are 5,500 documents.
Manuscripts, yes.
Manuscripts. How many of those, do you know how many of those 5,500 are alike?
How many of them are like in what sense?
How many are identical?
Identical. Almost none of them. Actually, all of them are not identical. Then that would be due primarily to spelling, because they didn't have spell check. And if you look at all of that, whether you're talking to Bart Ehrman or Dr. Daniel Wallace, they will talk about that a lot of these are due to copying down the Greek, and it's the word order. A lot of it is the spelling. but the very number of those manuscripts gives greater confidence. And you'll even ask Bart Ehrman that, and he would say that that still gives great confidence that there's a historical Jesus. So the fact that there's manuscriptal variety, you have that with any ancient author. So I'm not very bothered by the fact that there's variation in spelling or word order.
We acknowledge that there are some differences that are important.
I would say that the biggest difference to my knowledge is that the sign of the beast may not be 666, and the other two ones would be that some manuscripts do not have some of like the longer ending of Mark, and also the woman caught in adultery. So there's not complete agreement on those things, as well as I believe there's some passage. I want to say it's in Timothy or something where it's talking about and the three are one, and like basically it's a Trinitarian nod, and that I would say is probably not some of the early manuscripts. But in terms of referencing that there's a Jesus as opposed to not a Jesus, I would say that there are none that are significant and would highly dispute that he was earthly and that he existed.
By the way, as an aside, the 666 and 616
That's
are
right.
just different spellings of Nero. So they're pointing, they were trying to speak in code essentially about Nero. But yeah, the first mark of the beast number is actually 616. That's the earliest one that we have.
That's right.
Yeah, I feel like this is all coming apart here because I don't know my notes and things. But are you aware of what percentage of Mark was copied by Matthew and Luke?
Quite a bit. I would say that when you look at it, it's almost word for word between especially Mark and Matthew. Luke provides a little bit more, and we believe that he has a different source that he's referencing. John is almost completely his own, but you look at Paul, and he's quoting what seems to be an early, oral source when he's in 1 Corinthians 11 saying, this is what I received. And he quotes Jesus in what is contemporarily known as the
Corinthian
Last
Creed.
Supper. Yeah. So like when he's quoting that's also directly quoted by Luke as well, which would seem to indicate once again that there's another source other than just these gospel experts. There would seem to be an eyewitness source. My guess would be Peter, or some of the closest apostles.
Yeah, the actual numbers are 97% of Mark was copied, often word for word, Matthew copies 94% and Luke copies 88% of Mark's material. Wouldn't that indicate to you that they were not eyewitnesses?
Yeah, no, I would say explicitly Luke and Mark are definitely not. Matthew, I'm on the fence about, but all of them, including Paul, are quoting the source that does seem to be an eyewitness. And that's no problem for me as a minimal historicist, because there are a lot of historians that are referenced in the work of other historians, and they will quote at length different people, and they try and use earlier and better sources than themselves. So that, far from deflating me, I think makes the point that they're not just making it up on their own. They're referencing, here's what, I talked with Peter and we all sat around while Peter was saying this, and then I went back and I copied this, and Matthew is like taking notes as well, because they want an earlier source that is contemporaneous to Jesus.
So with that answer, basically, Dr. Evil, as you were asking that question to Silvie, we had hit the 4 minutes for cross-examination. I know you mentioned that you don't have your notes in front of you. I thought you still asked some great questions going into the manuscript evidence.
I was going to say, does he need an extra minute because he had to relocate?
Yeah,
I would like to follow up with, can I just read directly from Ehrman that I know you mentioned Ehrman, and Ehrman actually states here that mythicist arguments are fairly plausible. Jesus was never mentioned in any Roman sources, and there is no archaeological evidence that Jesus ever existed. He says, quote, this is all in one quote, even Christian sources are problematic. The Gospels came long after Jesus's death, written by people who never saw the man. So I acknowledge that he's firmly believes that Jesus was a historical person.
So, Dr. Evil, so after the finish of that cross-examination, the next part is the second affirmative, is what it's officially called. Basically, you are responding to Silvie's negative position, and you're kind of rebuilding your case for the affirmative. So we can certainly start, and I think the quote that you just read is actually probably a great intro for your second affirmative
so I'm
position.
making an affirmative, I'm supporting my assertion then.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So you now have 5 minutes to reaffirm your position that Jesus is a myth. So you can spend that responding to things that Silvie has said, or you can reiterate things that you have said that you do not believe that Silvie has responded to adequately. You have 5 minutes to essentially build your case as well as you can.
Okay, I got it.
Do you need a minute or two? I know you changed positions and you said that you may not have had your notes. Do you need anything?
I might run in there. I think my computer's still booting in there, but I kind of look like I'm in my evil lair here.
Yeah. Dr. Evil in his evil dark lair, exactly. So whenever you're comfortable going, we can start. If you need to take a minute to check on your
I'm good.
PC. Okay. As soon as you start, then I will start the timer and mute myself.
Okay, I think you broke up a bit there. I was getting scared again, but thank you again, Diddy. So I might be rehashing some of this. Silvie mentioned Roman sources. Well, none of these Roman historians were even alive during the purported time of Jesus. Silvie mentioned a document within the first century in 93 AD. Well, it's a little more messy than that. That was published in 93 AD, but the references to Jesus are not found in those oldest manuscripts. And this work is called Antiquity of the Jews. So Jesus is actually not mentioned in those. In fact, we cannot date any of Josephus's works before the 11th century, and that those that survived were all copied by Christian monks. And we actually have seen edits that they made, and there's pictures of it where you can see where they scratched out a word and put in another one. So that's not exactly accurate to say that Jesus was mentioned by Josephus in 93 AD. That book was published then, but there were no references to Jesus at that time. He mentions several others. I don't recall them all, but I've got a list here. We know Pontius Pilate didn't even write anything about Jesus. We know Herod didn't. We know Marabar Scarpion wasn't even born until 50 AD. Tacitus wasn't born until 56 AD. I remember him mentioning Pliny the Younger wasn't even born until 61 AD. So all they are doing, these are historians, all they were doing is documenting the Christian movement. I often see it asserted in these Christian themed YouTube channels that they all affirmed that Jesus existed. Well, some of them don't even mention Jesus; they're just mentioning Christians. And I've got a list here of probably 30 historians that lived during the time of Jesus and never mentioned him. And some of those were in those region, and you would expect a person of his purported acts and scope of his preaching would have been recognized, certainly by those in the within his community. Give me a second here. I'm going to try to refresh my mind. I might want to run in and get my notes. Can you allow me 10 seconds?
Yeah, I've paused the timer. Please.
Okay.
So now Dr. Evil's dog will take over his affirmative position.
Okay, I'm back.
If you need a moment to review your notes, just let me know when you're ready to go. You have 2 minutes left. I paused the timer at 3 minutes.
All right.
So, Dr. Evil, just so you know, I've paused my timer at 3 minutes. You still have 2 minutes left of your case. So as soon as you resume, I'll get going.
Thank you. Okay, I'm ready to continue.
I'm ready when you are. I'll start as soon. I'll resume my timer as soon as you begin.
Okay, I just want to another point I want to make is that the gospel authors, well, it's often asserted to me that the gospels, that the authors of, well, okay, actually what is asserted to me is that there was an apostle John and Matthew who walked with Jesus and witnessed him. But both of those gospels clearly state the opposite. They're written in the third person. So I know it's often asserted to me that, that was common back then. But I won't bore everybody by reading all this, but there are several statements here in John and Matthew that are describing somebody else, supposedly this person of Matthew. I also wrote down here, I can't remember the context now, where Silvie mentioned that Jesus was just a humble man and he wouldn't have attracted attention. In fact, he was out there stirring trouble up in the temple, right? He didn't like the blood sacrifices that were there. That was his mission. He was essentially the creator. He might have been the creator of Christianity, but he could also make the point that he created PETA. He didn't like that, and he talks about Luke 19:27. Those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me. And Luke 12:49. I have come to bring fire on earth, and how I wish it was already kindled. And this Matthew quote that I'm sure you know, do not suppose that I have come to bring peace on earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword, to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother. So he might have, his goal might have been good. Whether he's historical or fictional, this character was not humble. He was bold. He confronted people, and one could. It seems obvious that that's what got him killed. He just, angered too many of the wrong people.
So with that, now that you finished that thought, we're at time. So thank you, Dr. Evil. I'm glad we were able to get your notes back in your hands. Silvie, I will mute myself in just a second, but again, let me know whenever you're ready, or let me know if you want a minute or two.
And it's 5 minutes for this one, is that right?
5 minutes, yeah.
All right. I'm ready to go.
Okay. I'll start the timer as soon as you begin.
Let's begin. So Mike had basically, in reference to the independent collaboration argument, made the point that not all of the sources were alive during the time of Jesus. But once again, that assumes that that is a norm for the ancient times. This is just not the case. When you look at ancient times, the difference in terms of when you start getting manuscripts and writings of people is measured in centuries, not decades. He said that, for example, Tacitus was not a contemporary. He was just documenting the Christian movement. Yeah, but he wasn't a contemporary of Tiberius, but we still use this man to determine the historicity of Tiberius as emperor. He's seen as the best source for the emperor, even though he wasn't alive, he wasn't born by the time that this emperor died. So if we're asking ourselves about the historicity of a character, and we're looking at the common practices of that day, we have to look at what is common in the ancient world before a printing press, before mass media or video. We do see that when there is reference, so with Tacitus, he references that in fact there is this political proceeding during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. He's referencing this as if it's a historical event while he's talking about Nero's response years later. So he treats it as a history. As a historian, he looks at it and he says, this is as real as Tiberius is. So prove to me, establish why we should believe that his view of Tiberius as a historical character is justified, even though he's not a contemporaneous, but his view of this Jesus, who he's saying was crucified, is a myth. That somehow Paul made the myth so real that even this Roman historian is getting suckered into it. The next biggest argument that he made is basically Josephus, well, interpolations. It was written by the monks. Well, all of the documents are written by monks. Much of what we have, including the Gallic Wars, all of them, they're written by monks in the medieval ages. So are we going to say that that's the standard of historicity? Then no history happened prior to the printing press. In terms of Josephus, though, there are two places. So it's not just the one issue where it's talking about, he is the Christ. I agree. I think that there's a much more probable explanation where it talks about during this time that he was believed to be the Christ. So there's one reference, which is Antiquity of the Jews, book 18, but there's also book 20, which is seen as more authentic by the scholars, that the high priest at that time, Annas, assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. We can say, none of what this says is true. It's all interpolation, but what's the proof? Why are we saying that these two passages, and most historians don't agree that it's these two passages, because of this one passage from Josephus that is authentic and does reference Jesus as a historical character. Once again, it relies on your belief that this is a myth and here's this internal coherent plot. But I come once again back to the question that if it's Paul, if he's making it up, why would he do that? We have no reference to this Daniel prophecy. We have no reference to this idea that he's interacting with also made up characters like Peter and James. He himself doesn't claim that. Are we to believe that he's Paul, but then also that he's lying when he says, here's my own personal biography? There's no consistent standard for that. I'd like to conclude just by looking at the gospel accounts. When Mike is talking about Jesus is causing a stir, yes, but the point is that he is a lowly character, not that he is somehow personally, characteristically humble, but that compared to the Roman emperor, we have no reason to expect that he would be as rich and as powerful, and that he would have as much evidence. That's the point that I continually come back to. It's unrealistic to assume more or the equal standard that he would have as much archaeological and manuscriptal evidence as a Roman emperor. And also from the reference that was made in cross-examination, it is clear that these gospel accounts, they didn't witness it, but they're clearly interacting with people who did. And you see that through the continual copying of these quotations from an early source in Paul through Mark, which is before the first, like it's within that first century. We see that there is a case for the historical Jesus.
So with that, Silvie finishes his second. Dr. Evil, the final section here is the final rebuttal. So this is the each of you will have 4 minutes. Dr. Evil, you will begin first as the affirmative position. So this is your final opportunity to respond to what Silvie has said thus far, and then also make whatever final statement you want to leave with the audience as the last part of your piece in the debate. So as soon as you're ready to begin that, let me know.
I am ready.
Okay. Then I will, let me reset my timer here. So again, each of you has 4 minutes for this. Dr. Evil, as soon as you're ready, I will start my timer, and I'm going to mute myself now.
All right, thank you. So, thank you. Silvie mentioned that there's different standards, that we have great gaps between a purported existence of a historical figure and some kind of documentation of him. But the difference with Jesus is that we know how, who, and when the fiction started. In other words, we can't source, to use the Alexander the Great example again, no one is asserting that there's a hierarchy of documents that all go to a single point. But that is what happened with Jesus. It started with Paul, and then Mark used his theology as the basis, and then Matthew and Luke copied them largely word for word, almost in totality. So that's the difference. We know where it started. It wasn't a grassroots, broad-based movement with multiple sources. In fact, all of the Gospels were written from hundreds of miles away in Greek by people who never saw the man. None of these Roman sources that Jesus interacted with, purportedly, there's no record of him at all. And the Romans were fastidious record keepers, and there's no records of that. And again, so the Christian version is, well, they're trying to, snuff out the Jesus movement by destroying all that. But I would expect there to be some documentation. There's all those historians that lived at the time and region of Jesus. And Jesus, the account was that he was known throughout Syria and followed by great multitudes. There's no record of him anywhere contemporaneously. If it was important enough, you'd expect something. But this all can be traced to Paul. And Paul, none of the gospel authors even claim to have met Jesus. Paul is the only one. Paul claims that he met Jesus in a vision, and he described him as being only a bright light. I don't believe him. I guess I'll end it right there. When I first, I was not, my whole life, I didn't really know who these Bible figures are. When I first learned about Paul, I was like, oh, he's my prime suspect. There you go. You can take the rest, Silvie.
Okay. So, Dr. Evil, you used about 3 minutes there. So again, I just want to confirm that you're fine with your statements there.
I am, thank you.
Okay. And so now, Silvie, this is your final negative rebuttal. So again, this is your opportunity to respond to Dr. Evil's statements and make your final points for the negative position, being that Jesus is not a myth. And then that will wrap up our formal debate scenario. So, Dr. Evil, you may disagree with something that Silvie says there in his final rebuttal, but just yeah. So, but as far as the debate goes, your statements have concluded. I guess just to make that clear, and that goes for both of you, I guess.
Mike, can you mute really quickly? Mute the mic.
Me?
Because I'm getting feedback. No, from Mike, from Dr.
Oh,
Evil.
sure.
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. So
right.
he is muted. Okay, Silvie, whenever you're ready to go, hold on. I keep not remembering to reset my timer. Okay. So as soon as you begin, I will start my timer.
Let's begin. We are looking at the source of the smoke. Why are there ripples in the pond? And how do you get Christianity without Christ? Today, I've made my case based on the independent corroboration, the impressive web of transmission, and the irreverent/irrelevant details that we have strong reason to believe that Jesus did exist. This is a question of historicity, and this is based on the standards of that day and age. And compared to any other person from that time, it is impressive. Do we have all the evidence that we want? No. But compared to the others, it is impressive. The same arguments that Mike uses about why it's not sufficient, these people didn't directly see it. Most events, most people in the ancient world were not directly observed. The fact that he claims that, well, we have the who, the when, the how, where the fiction began, that's Paul. Another way to say that is we have a named source for the earliest biographer of Jesus. That's what we would say with any other character. If we had a named source for a contemporary figure that's writing about Alexander the Great, we would say that's not therefore a fiction, but that's a named biographer, and it gives more credence, not less. My opponent has doubts, and that's okay, but he asks us to set aside those doubts with his position. We are just to believe that Paul exists. Why? Because, well, he says it, but that everything else he writes is a lie. This very real Paul is motivated by an obscure prediction from the prophet Daniel, even though no direct reference is made. Despite all the myriads of figures who are not mythical surrounding Jesus, Jesus is a perfectly made myth. This conspiracy, which spans 2,000 years and across 3 continents, just happened without any slips or exposure, because Paul really got it. And he himself doesn't even say that he got it. He said he persecuted the church. He said he met with the early church leaders. So he's not the genesis of this start. So we can either believe Paul or we can believe a hypothesis. And in order to maintain the internal consistency of that hypothesis, we arbitrarily decide what is genuine recordings and what is a myth. Jesus is a myth because that fits the hypothesis. But what about these writers that write apart from Paul? Well, they're myths because of the hypothesis. The gospel manuscripts are too late. Why? Not because of historical standards, but because of this hypothesis. When we go through all of these claims, the same historians that we trust for Tiberius, why can't we trust them for Jesus? When we look at Josephus and we look at the other things that he wrote, and we're not assuming that the monks just scrubbed everything that doesn't look good for them, because Josephus doesn't always portray Christians in a good light. We assume that they're honest in that regard, but dishonest in other regards. That doesn't make sense. Either he references and believes that there's a historical Jesus, or he doesn't. But we can't base that just on the fact that it will help the Jesus myth hypothesis. We have to base it on the evidence, on our best guess of what is actually happening. And we look and we see that compared to all the other writers, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Tiberius Caesar, all of these characters, they have either less or somewhat equal sources of evidence for their historicity, and we accept that. Why would we not accept this for Jesus? If you can conclude that the smoke does need fire, that these ripples happened because of something or someone, that this Christianity doesn't just spring from the mind of a random Jewish scholar, that is a minimal historical position, and it is a rejection of a mythical position. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Silvie and Dr. Evil, Mike, for your participation in the debate. I thought it was a lot of fun. I don't know how
It
both
was
of
a
you feel.
lot
I
of
know
fun. It's
I
It
know
was
we
good.
had some technical difficulties on Dr. Evil's position, so sorry about that. But
God,
I think you were still
works
I was
in
still very
mysterious
impressed with
ways.
your ability to recover and
Yeah.
make cogent arguments still, even without your typical setup.
I'm going to stop the recording now if that's okay.
Oh, do we want to do like a little sign off? Goodbye, everybody.
Oh,
I don't
thanks
know.
for watching. We will definitely have this on both our channels, I feel pretty confident saying.
We're all very professional YouTubers.
Yeah.
Well, I hope we have a good recording, right?
Oops.
We have a good recording. We'll look into it.
Yeah, I hope so.
Alrighty.
Goodbye.
I've got
Bye,
to
everybody.
take care.